Did you think I would miss the celebration of a miracle, Alistair? After all, you're the one who taught me how rare they are. The words sliced through the heavy silence of the Thorne estate, as every diamond-clad guest froze in place. I watched Alistair's face, usually a mask of billionaire arrogance, drain of all color, while his new high society bride clutched his arm as if her social standing depended on it. The same man who had served me divorce papers in a boardroom 2 years ago, telling me I was incomplete and a liability to his legacy, now stood paralyzed. Behind me, the scissor doors of a white and gold Bugatti glided upward, and 2 identical little girls, Zora and Zahara, stepped out onto his pristine lawn. You know what they say about karma in the fast lane. She doesn't just arrive, she outruns your lies. And sometimes, she brings double the trouble. My name is Naomi Whitaker now. For 10 years, I was merely the first Mrs. Thorne, a woman who spent her nights crying in sterile fertility clinics while her husband whispered that I was a broken vessel. This is the story of how I went from being discarded like a faulty prototype to becoming the CEO of my own destiny, watching Alistair's carefully constructed world incinerate as my daughters, carrying a name he can never claim, reclaimed the throne he said I'd never have. But before you witness this masterclass in reclamation, I need you to understand something. If you've ever been gaslit into believing you're not enough, if you've ever been told your value is tied to your utility, or if you've been thrown away because you didn't fit someone else's corporate vision, this story is for you. Because sometimes the universe doesn't just give you a second chance, it gives you a Bugatti and the truth. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe your worth is never determined by anyone who cannot see it. The roar of the W16 engine announced my arrival long before the gates of the Thorne estate swung open. It was a primal, sophisticated scream that demanded the attention of every blue-blooded guest sipping vintage champagne on the lawn. As I steered the white and gold Bugatti Chiron onto the manicured gravel path, the vibration rattled the very foundations of the house Alistair had once used as my gilded cage. I could see the sea of pastel linen and silk dresses, parting in a wave of confusion. I brought the beast to a purring halt directly in front of the stone patio, exactly where the heir-apparent banner hung in mocking celebration. Through the tinted glass I saw Alistair. He was standing near the tiered cake, looking every bit the corporate king, until his eyes locked onto the car. I watched the recognition hit him, not of the woman inside, but of the sheer, unadulterated power the vehicle represented. The hydraulic hiss of the scissor door opening was the only sound in the sudden deafening silence. I stepped out first, my heels clicking against the stone with the rhythm of a closing trap. I didn't look like the woman who had left this house in tears 2 years ago. I looked like the woman who had bought the bank that held his mortgage. My dress was a custom-tailored masterpiece of midnight silk, a sharp contrast to the soft, weak colors of his new life. "You're late, Naomi," Alistair managed to stammer, his voice thin, his face a pale mask of shock. He tried to reclaim his dominance, his hand tightening on the arm of his visibly pregnant, trembling wife. "And this display? It's a bit desperate, don't you think?" I didn't answer him with words. Instead, I leaned back into the Bugatti and reached for the safety straps. From the passenger side, I lifted Zora, her dark curls bouncing and her designer dress shimmering in the sun. Then, I turned back for Zahara. The collective gasp from the crowd was a symphony of cosmic justice. As I stood there, a twin on each hip, the resemblance was undeniable. They had my eyes, my smile, and a vitality that Alistair had spent a decade trying to convince me I was incapable of producing. They weren't just children. They were living, breathing evidence of his deceit. I watched Alistair's gaze dart from my face to theirs, his brain struggling to compute the reality of the 2 miracles he had claimed I could never have. "I'm not late, Alistair," I said, my voice steady and cold as a winter morning. "I'm exactly on time. I brought the only thing this party was missing, the truth." Zora giggled, pointing at the oversized teddy bear near the entrance, her tiny hand reaching out toward a world that had once been told she would never exist. I didn't need to yell. The silence of the elite was the loudest applause I'd ever heard. The Thorne mansion was a masterpiece of cold marble and calculated silence, a 3-story monument to Alistair's ego that I had once mistaken for a home. In those early years, the house felt like a velvet-lined jewelry box, and I was the crown jewel, polished and placed on display to signal his ascending status. But as the seasons bled into one another without the patter of small feet on the limestone floors, the box began to feel more like a vault. Alistair didn't see a partner when he looked at me across the 20-foot mahogany dining table. He saw a high-end investment that wasn't yielding its expected dividend. Every morning began with the same suffocating ritual of performance. I had to be dressed in the exact shade of cream he preferred, my hair swept into a tight architectural bun that pulled at my scalp, looking every bit the pristine billionaire's wife. To Alistair, my primary function was to remain beautiful and silent until I could be useful. We spent our evenings at charity galas where he would rest a heavy, proprietary hand on the small of my back, parading me in front of board members like a prize pony. But the moment we were behind the soundproofed walls of the estate, the mask slipped. The warmth was replaced by a clinical, biting frost. He began to treat my body like a faulty piece of hardware, a machine that refused to boot up. He would stare at me over his morning espresso, his eyes scanning me with the detached disappointment of a foreman inspecting a cracked foundation. "A Thorne legacy requires more than just a pretty face in a dress, Naomi," he would say, his voice devoid of affection. "I've built an empire. It's your job to ensure it doesn't end with me. Is that really too much to ask of you?" He filled our schedules with appointments with world-renowned specialists, but he never came inside the exam rooms. He would wait in the lobby, checking his stocks on his phone, while I was poked and prodded, feeling more like a biological specimen than a human being. When the test came back inconclusive, he didn't offer comfort. He offered a critique. He started suggesting that perhaps my stress was the defect, or that my heritage had gifted me with biological stubbornness. He began to talk about me in the third person while I was standing right in front of him, complaining to his mother or his lawyer about the complications with his wife's constitution. I was a malfunctioning appliance in a house full of perfect things, an expensive, beautiful failure that he was rapidly losing the patience to repair. I was living in a golden cage, and the bars were made of his growing contempt. The clinical scent of the private wing at the Thorne Wellness Center was enough to make my stomach turn, a sharp, metallic odor that smelled of money and bad news. Alistair walked 2 paces ahead of me, his stride confident, his shoulders square, the posture of a man who had already bought the conclusion to the story he was about to tell. He had dismissed my previous doctors, claiming their equipment was substandard and their intellect common. Today he was bringing in the heavy artillery, Dr. Eris Thorne's personal selection of specialists, men whose research Alistair's foundations had funded for years. Inside the examination room, the atmosphere was frigid. Dr. Sterling didn't look at me as a person. He looked at my charts with a thin, rehearsed grimace. The consultation was a blur of high-level medical jargon designed to alienate me from my own body. They spoke of chromosomal incompatibility, uterine senescence, and irreversible reproductive failure. When I tried to ask about the tests I'd taken elsewhere, tests that had shown me perfectly healthy, drive, Sterling offered a condescending smile that never reached his eyes. "Naomi, dear, those labs were looking for shadows. We are looking at the sun. The data is definitive. You are, for lack of a more diplomatic term, biologically stagnant." Alistair didn't flinch. He sat in the corner, steepled his fingers, and nodded, as if he were receiving a quarterly earnings report that met his low expectations. "So there's no fix?" Alistair asked, his voice carrying a staged heaviness. "No amount of investment can repair the damage?" "I'm afraid not, Mr. Thorne," the doctor replied, finally turning to me with a look of practiced pity. "It's a fundamental defect. Some vessels simply aren't meant to hold life." The word defect hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I looked at Alistair, searching for a spark of husbandly grief, a hand to hold, a word of, "It's okay, we'll figure this out." Instead, I found only a cold, terrifying clarity. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and vindication. In that moment, the medical gaslight was blinding. I felt my spirit shatter, the shards piercing my confidence until I truly believed the lie. I wasn't just a woman who couldn't conceive. I was a broken product, a faulty machine that had failed the Thorne legacy. As we walked back to the car in silence, Alistair let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Well, Naomi," he whispered, not even bothering to look at me, "at least now we know why you've been such a disappointment. I suppose I have some very difficult decisions to make regarding our future." I sat in the passenger seat of his sedan, feeling hollowed out, unaware that the doctor's reports in his briefcase were as forged as his love for me. I was a prisoner to a diagnosis that didn't exist, crushed by a man who had paid for the privilege of calling me barren. The annual Thorne Foundation Gala was supposed to be a celebration of philanthropy, but the moment we stepped into the ballroom, I realized I was the evening's sacrificial lamb. The air was thick, with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a suffocating sweetness that felt like a funeral shroud. I was draped in a silver gown Alistair had chosen personally, a dress designed to make me look ethereal, or perhaps, as I realized too late, like a ghost that was already fading away. Alistair didn't stay by my side. He moved through the crowd with a predatory grace, leaving me to endure the pitying glances of high society matrons who had heard the whispers from the specialists. I stood alone by the champagne tower, a hollow ornament, until the chimes signaled Alistair taking the stage. He looked magnificent under the spotlights, the quintessential titan of industry, but his smile had a jagged edge I hadn't seen before. "Tonight is about legacy," Alistair began, his voice booming through the silent hall. "And a legacy is only as strong as the foundation it is built upon. For too long, I have prioritized tradition over progress, both in my business and my personal life." He didn't look at me, yet the entire room turned their heads in my direction. I felt the heat of 100 judgmental eyes. It is with a heavy heart but a clear vision for the future that I announced the dissolution of my marriage to Naomi. We have reached a point where our paths and our abilities to fulfill the Thorne lineage no longer align. The gasp that rippled through the ballroom was followed by a silence so sharp it felt like a blade. But Alistair wasn't finished. He reached out a hand toward the wings of the stage. "However, a Thorne does not stay in the dark for long. Please join me in welcoming the future of my house, my fiancée, Juliana Vance, and the heir she is already carrying." A younger woman, radiant in a dress that hugged a small but unmistakable curve at her waist, stepped out and took his hand. The betrayal was so sudden, so surgically precise, that I felt my knees buckle. He hadn't just divorced me, he had branded me a failure in front of everyone who mattered, using my supposed defect as the opening act for his new life. I waited for him to look at me, to show even a flicker of remorse for the 10 years I had given him, but he was already leaning in to kiss Juliana's cheek to a roar of polite, horrified applause. I was no longer the crown jewel. I was the scrap metal he had tossed aside to make room for a shinier model. Without a word, I turned and walked toward the exit, the silver fabric of my dress catching the light one last time as I vanished into the night, leaving the Thorne legacy and my dignity in the dust behind him. The transition from the Thorne estate to a cramped studio apartment in the city felt less like a move and more like an eviction from life itself. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television, a constant buzzing reminder that I was no longer shielded by the soundproofed luxury of the suburbs. My belongings were reduced to a few suitcases of clothes and a second-hand laptop, the remnants of a decade spent building a dream that Alistair had set on fire for the sake of a new headline. I spent those first few weeks in a haze of numbing silence, staring at the ceiling and wondering how a body could feel so heavy when it had been called so empty. The 0 hour arrived on a Tuesday when the rain lashed against the single window of my kitchenette. I was sorting through my old digital archives, trying to find tax documents to prove I was worth more than the $0 Alistair's lawyers had argued for in our settlement. My eyes were burning from the glow of the screen when I stumbled upon a folder buried deep in a cloud drive we had shared during the early years. It was labeled with a cryptic string of numbers, a medical billing code I didn't recognize. Curiosity, or perhaps a final spark of self-preservation, made me click. Inside was a PDF from a clinic in Switzerland, dated 6 months before our wedding. It wasn't my name on the header. It was Alistair's. As I read the clinical notes, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. The report was blunt: severe oligospermia. Genetic markers indicating near-zero viability for natural conception. I scrolled further, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There were follow-up emails between Alistair and a private consultant, the very same specialist, who had later looked me in the eye and called me a broken vessel. In one exchange, Alistair had been explicit. "If the tests on my wife show she is healthy, bury the results. I cannot have the Thorne name associated with a biological failure on my part. She will be the one we fix. She will be the reason." The air in the tiny apartment felt suddenly electric. The barren diagnosis, the years of hormone injections that had ravaged my moods, the public shaming at the gala. It was all a curated performance. He had used his billions to buy a medical lie and had cast me as the villain in a tragedy he had written to protect his own ego. I wasn't the malfunctioning machine. I was the scapegoat for a man too small to admit his own limitations. For the first time in 2 years, the weight in my chest didn't feel like grief. It felt like a fuse being lit. I wasn't empty. I was full of a cold, white-hot rage that was about to change everything. The fire Alistair thought would consume me only served to temper the steel in my soul. I stopped looking at my reflection and seeing a broken vessel, and started seeing a founder. With the truth of his medical deception acting as a high-octane fuel, I took the meager remains of my savings, money he thought was too small to matter, and wagered it all on myself. I shed the name Thorne like a layer of dead skin, returning to Naomi Whitaker, but this time, the name didn't belong to a daughter or a wife. It belonged to an empire. I rented a workspace that was little more than a glass-walled closet in the tech district, a far cry from the mahogany-paneled offices Alistair occupied, but the air there was cleaner, because it was mine. I launched Whitaker Capital with a focus that was surgical and relentless. I knew the luxury market better than any man in a tailored suit because I had lived as one of its silent ornaments. I began to identify undervalued, female-led startups that the old boys club ignored, investing not just capital, but the raw, unyielding grit I had forged in the dark. My business spine grew with every successful pitch and every closed deal. I traded the restrictive, cream-colored dresses of my past for sharp, commanding silhouettes in deep blacks and power reds. I no longer walked into rooms hoping to be liked. I walked in expecting to be heard. As my firm gained momentum, a strange thing happened to my body. Away from the toxic stress of Alistair's gaslighting and the invasive, unnecessary hormone treatments he had forced upon me, I began to heal. The chronic fatigue lifted, the shadow under my eyes vanished, and for the first time in a decade, I felt physically vibrant. I wasn't just building a portfolio, I was rebuilding my cellular health, reclaiming my rhythm from a man who had tried to silence my heartbeat. By the end of the first year, Whitaker Capital wasn't just surviving, it was a disruptor. I was no longer the woman who sat quietly at gala tables. I was the woman the tables were being set for. I had learned that Alistair's greatest mistake wasn't just lying to me. It was assuming that once he stripped away the Mrs. Thorne title, there would be nothing left. He didn't realize that by taking away the gilded cage, he had accidentally released the lion. I was healthy, I was wealthy, and for the first time in my life, I was truly dangerous. Success was a powerful aphrodisiac, but it was also a filter. It washed away the men who were intimidated by my light and left only those who were strong enough to bask in it. I met Marcus at a venture capital summit in Zurich. The irony of being back in the city where Alistair had forged my medical records wasn't lost on me. Marcus didn't look at me like a decorative asset to be managed, or a defective machine to be repaired. When he looked at me, he saw a peer. He was a man who had built his own legacy with clean hands and a clear heart, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly seen. Our relationship was built on a foundation of transparency that made my previous marriage look like a house of smoke and mirrors. I was terrified to tell him about the barren label I'd carried for a decade, but when I finally did, Marcus didn't offer the clinical pity Alistair had perfected. He simply took my hand, looked me in the eye, and said, "Naomi, a woman's worth isn't a math equation based on her biology. You are more than enough exactly as you are." That moment of unconditional acceptance did more for my health than 1,000 hormone injections ever could. I stopped viewing my body as a battlefield and started seeing it as a temple. The miracle happened 3 months after we married. It wasn't the result of a sterile lab or a paid-off specialist. It happened naturally, in the quiet, joyful peace of a life lived without fear. When the test turned positive, I stared at it for hours, the white-hot rage I'd felt toward Alistair finally cooling into a serene, powerful satisfaction. But the universe wasn't done with its cosmic justice. At the 8-week ultrasound, the technician smiled and turned the screen toward us, revealing 2 rhythmic, flickering pulses. "Double the blessings," she whispered. I burst into tears, not of sorrow, but of ultimate vindication. The twins, Zora and Zahara, were the final proof that Alistair's lie was exactly that, a pathetic fabrication by a man too weak to face his own reality. My body hadn't failed. It had simply been waiting for an environment where love replaced stress, and truth replaced gaslighting. As Marcus held me, watching the 2 heartbeats on the screen, I realized that Alistair hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost the chance to see what a real miracle looked like. I wasn't just healthy, I was flourishing, and the living proof was already growing inside me, carrying a name that would never be Thorne. The invitation didn't arrive via a standard courier. It was hand-delivered to my office by Alistair's longtime personal driver, a man who had once looked at me with pity and now couldn't even meet my eyes. It was encased in a heavy, cream-colored envelope that felt like a relic from a life I had long since buried. The paper was thick enough to be a weapon, embossed with the Thorne family crest, a symbol that had once represented my imprisonment but now felt like a desperate attempt at relevance. I opened it with a steady hand, a sharp contrast to the trembling woman who had left that estate 2 years prior. Inside, the script was sprawling and arrogant. It was an invitation to the Thorne legacy, heir apparent baby shower. The wording was intentionally cruel, a calculated jab at the barren label Alistair had used to discard me. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a victory lap. Alistair clearly believed that while he was ascending into the fatherhood he felt he deserved, I was still huddled in some dark corner of the city, mourning the loss of his shadow. He had no idea that while he was busy planning a party for an heir he'd bought with lies, I had been busy building a dynasty founded on the truth. I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight of my high-rise office catching the diamond on my finger, a ring that symbolized a partnership Alistair was incapable of understanding. I knew exactly why he had sent it. He wanted me to see Juliana's glowing face. He wanted me to feel the sting of the nursery I could never fill. He wanted to see me broken one last time so he could finally feel secure in his own hollow success. He assumed I was still the malfunctioning appliance he had tossed aside, unaware that I was now the one who owned the factory. The arrogance of the man was almost poetic. He truly thought he was the sun, and that I was still a cold moon reflecting his light. I looked at the date and time, then glanced at the photo of Marcus, Zora, and Zahara on my desk. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Alistair wanted an audience for his miracle, and I was more than happy to provide one. He wanted to mock my empty arms, so I would show him exactly how full they had become. I didn't need to write a response. My arrival would be the only RSVP he would ever remember. I tucked the invitation into my purse, already hearing the roar of the Bugatti engine in my mind. The stage was set for a masterclass in reclamation, and Alistair Thorne had just handed me the front-row tickets to his own undoing. Preparation was no longer about physical endurance or medical compliance. It was a cold, calculated exercise in brand management. If Alistair wanted to stage a theatrical performance of his supposed superiority, I was going to provide a spectacle that would render his entire production obsolete. I didn't just need to show up. I needed to arrive with the force of a tectonic shift. I spent the week leading up to the shower finalizing the details of my most aggressive acquisition yet. It wasn't a company or a patent. It was a custom-commissioned Bugatti Chiron, a machine that cost more than the Thorne estate's initial down payment. The car was more than a vehicle. It was an extension of my new identity. It was built with the same precision and unapologetic power I had used to rebuild my life. I chose a finish in Vengeance White, with gold leaf accents that shimmered like armor. Sitting in the driver's seat for the first time, surrounded by the scent of Italian leather and the hum of 16 cylinders, I felt a level of control that Alistair had spent 10 years trying to strip away from me. This wasn't the car of a broken incubator. This was the chariot of a tech titan who had outpaced every expectation. I spent the morning of the event at a private studio, curated not for a man's approval, but for my own sense of regality. My stylist draped me in a custom-tailored suit that blurred the line between high fashion and corporate warfare, deep, midnight silk that moved like liquid shadow. But the most important part of my strategy wasn't the car or the clothes. It was the 2 custom-made car seats I installed in the back of that hypercar. As I strapped Zora and Zahara into the Bugatti, their small, curious faces reflecting in the polished carbon fiber, I felt a surge of pride that was almost overwhelming. They were dressed in matching designer outfits that signaled their status as the true Thorne Slayers. They were my reinforcements, the living proof that Alistair's medical gaslighting had been a pathetic attempt to cage a lioness. Marcus kissed me before I pulled out of the driveway, his eyes full of the respect and partnership I had once thought was a myth. "Go finish it, Naomi," he whispered. I gripped the steering wheel, the power of 1,500 horses vibrating beneath my palms. I wasn't just driving to a baby shower. I was driving toward the final chapter of a decade-long war. I checked the rearview mirror, saw the 2 identical smiles of my daughters, and pressed the ignition. The roar of the engine was the sound of a woman who had finally found her voice, and I was about to make sure Alistair Thorne heard it loud and clear. The silence that met the Bugatti's roar was the most expensive sound I had ever heard. As the scissor doors glided upward, Alistair stood frozen, his hand still resting on Juliana's pregnant stomach, a gesture that now looked less like affection and more like a desperate attempt to anchor himself to a lie. I stepped out, my midnight silk suit shimmering with the cold brilliance of a diamond, and reached back for Zora and Zahara. The sight of the girls, identical reflections of my own features, sent a shockwave through the crowd that no corporate announcement could ever match. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Alistair," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the manicured lawn. "Or perhaps just a reality you spent a decade trying to erase." Alistair's face was a frantic mask of shifting expressions, shock, denial, and finally, a flickering, panicked rage. "This is impossible," he hissed, stepping toward me as the high society guests leaned in, their social appetites whetted by the impending scandal. Those aren't yours. You were diagnosed. I have the papers." "You have the papers you paid for," I corrected him, my gaze level and lethal. I pulled a slim, black tablet from my bag and tapped a single icon. Instantly, the massive LED screen Alistair had set up to show a slideshow of his legacy flickered. Instead of sonograms of Juliana's baby, it displayed the Swiss medical report I had found, the one detailing his own infertility, followed by the bank transfers he had made to Dr. Sterling's private offshore account. The gasps from the audience were like a physical tide. Alistair's mother, the matriarch of the Thorne reputation, turned ashen as she read the clinical notes on the screen. Juliana pulled away from him, her eyes wide with the realization that the miracle she was carrying might be under more scrutiny than she ever imagined. "You spent 10 years calling me a broken machine to hide your own shame," I said, the words finally releasing the last of the weight in my chest. "But life doesn't care about your bank account or your ego, Alistair. It only cares about the truth." I didn't stay to watch him crumble. I didn't need to see the board members in the crowd already whispering about his lack of integrity or the lawyers preparing the fallout. I simply buckled my daughters back into their seats. They were laughing, oblivious to the destruction their existence had just caused, and that was the greatest victory of all. I shifted the Bugatti into gear, the engine growling with a satisfied purr. As I accelerated toward the gates, Alistair Thorne became nothing more than a diminishing speck in my rearview mirror, a small man standing in a large, empty house built on sand. I wasn't driving away from my past. I was driving toward a future where his name was a footnote, and mine was the headline. The Thorne legacy was dead, but the Whittaker dynasty had just begun its first mile.